Some stories are more than just history. They need to be told because they're about the sheer force of a human being's will, the will to build, the will to fight, and the will to stand against impossible odds. Today, we're going to talk about one of those stories, the story of Samori Touré, a man who built an empire from nothing and then dared to defend it from one of the most powerful colonial forces on the planet.
And that's really the question at the heart of it all, isn't it? How does one person, one leader, stand up to an empire? It's not just about armies and tactics. It's about character. It's about a kind of resolve that can only be forged in the deepest kind of personal sacrifice. And his story, well, it begins not on a battlefield, but with an impossible choice. Every great life has a turning point, that single moment that changes the entire trajectory. For the young Samori, that moment wasn't some grand call to glory. It was a desperate act of love that would set the course for the rest of his life. Now, to really understand the man, you have to understand the world he was born into. We're talking about West Africa in the mid-19th century, a place in constant motion. Trade routes brought wealth, sure, but they also brought something that would change everything: modern firearms. This technology was a complete game changer, rewriting all the old rules of power. It was a volatile, dangerous, and for some, an opportunistic time.
This is his crucible. In 1853, his mother, Sokona Kamara, is captured in a raid by the rivals Sise clan. And the young Samori, a merchant at the time, makes an unthinkable choice. He walks straight into their camp, and he trades his own freedom for hers. For 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days, he served his enemies. But he didn't just serve. He watched. He learned discipline. He mastered the cold mechanics of modern guns. He learned the brutal arts of war. He walked into that camp a son. He would walk out a soldier.
So when he finally gained his freedom, he didn't just go back to his old life. He couldn't. He set out to build something new, something that would last, not just for himself, but for the people he would soon unite under one banner. And his rise was, well, it was meteoric. He started with just a small warband, and through a mix of raw force, smart diplomacy, and just sheer audacity, he began to carve out a territory. The Battle of Saman-Saman in 1873 was the real turning point. It cemented his authority. By 1878, he was powerful enough to proclaim himself Fama of his new Wassoulou Empire. And then, in 1884, he solidified it all under the banner of faith, taking the title Almami, the commander of the faithful.
And this title, Fama, is so important to understanding him. As you can see, this isn't a title you inherit like a king. It's one you earn. It's forged on the battlefield. It speaks of raw strength, of proven leadership, of the power to command. It was a declaration not of his birthright, but of who he had become.
But as Samori was building his empire from the inside, another empire was expanding from the outside. The Toubab, the local name for white men, were coming, specifically the French, pushing relentlessly eastward from their bases in Senegal. Their ambitions were on a direct collision course with his.
And this slide really lays out the fundamental mismatch. On one side, you have Samori's army of warriors, the Sofas. Huge numbers, incredible mobility, and they knew the terrain like the back of their hand. On the other side, the French. Far fewer soldiers, but they were armed with superior artillery, the latest repeating rifles, and backed by a massive logistical network. It was an asymmetric war from day one.
Those first encounters were a brutal education. The traditional head-on charges of Samori's warriors were met with a wall of modern firepower. It was a slaughter. But this is what made Samori a genius. He didn't break. He adapted. He immediately traded those frontal charges for ambushes, for guerrilla warfare. He used his cavalry for lightning-fast raids and then just melted back into the landscape he knew so well, constantly harassing, constantly bleeding the invaders.
The conflict just kept escalating. Samori's incredible resistance forced the French to commit more and more troops, more resources. The war entered a new, much more brutal phase. And it was then that Samori decided to make a massive gamble, to try and consolidate his power once and for all. 15 months. Think about that. For 15 agonizing months, Samori laid siege to the great fortified city of Sikasso. He threw everything he had at its walls. This was meant to be his crowning achievement.
But it wasn't to be. The siege of Sikasso was the high water mark of his empire. As the slide says, the city's defenses just held. Disease tore through his army, his supply lines broke down, and the failure was catastrophic. It shattered the myth of his invincibility, and rebellions started popping up all over his lands. The French saw their opening, and in 1891, they captured his capital. His greatest gamble had failed, and now everything started to come apart.
Cornered, with enemies on all sides, Samori made a terrible, defiant choice. If he could not hold his homeland, then the French would inherit nothing but ash. He adopted a scorched earth policy and began systematically destroying every village, every field, every well as he prepared for a long retreat.
What came next was one of the most remarkable and tragic chapters in the history of resistance. It wasn't just an army retreating. It was an entire empire on the march, a mobile state, fighting a desperate 7-year war of maneuver.
I mean, just try to picture this. For 7 years, Samori Touré evacuated his entire population, moving them eastward. His army became a vanguard, conquering new lands just to feed and house his people. And all the while, his rear guard fought this constant, bitter delaying action against the French, leaving literally nothing but cinders and ruin in their wake.
But it couldn't last. This timeline shows how it all unraveled. In 1897, when the great city of Kong rebels against him, he razes it to the ground. He just keeps pushing his people onward. But by 1898, that final march had become a nightmare. They were trapped in the mountains, attacked by hostile locals, and his people were starving. The end came not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet exhaustion of a surprise raid. He was captured, without a fight, on September 29, 1898.
The war was over. The man was a prisoner. But his story and the fight over what his life really meant was only just beginning.
The humiliation of his defeat was absolute. His conquerors paraded him around like a trophy. The night before he was to be shipped into exile, the great Almami, the man who commanded tens of thousands and ruled an empire, tried to take his own life. Even that final act of defiance was denied him. He was sent to an island prison in Gabon, a place the French called the dry guillotine because of its high death rate. Far from the lands he fought to build, far from his people, he died of pneumonia 2 years later. A quiet, lonely end for a man whose life had been a storm. So how is he remembered? Well, here's the impossible truth. To many, he is a hero, the ultimate symbol of African resistance. To others, he's a martyr who died for his people. But to the people who lived in the lands he conquered, or the ones who suffered through his brutal scorched earth retreat, he's remembered as a tyrant. And the truth is, he was all of these things at the same time. But his story didn't end with his death and exile. His legacy echoed down through the generations. Decades later, his own great-grandson, Ahmed Sékou Touré, would rise to become the very first president of an independent Guinea, finally fulfilling, in a new era, the fight for sovereignty that Samori Touré began. Which leaves us with a final, very difficult question. We see the conqueror and the freedom fighter, the victim and the tyrant, all wrapped up in one man. His story forces us to ask, when the battles are over and the dust finally settles, who gets to decide what makes a hero?